I'm Nick DiMartino. This is my workshop. We build a farmhouse table. The farmhouse table. There's got to be like 1,000 videos of farmhouse table builds on YouTube. So why am I doing it? Well, I'll tell you why. I got this job from a client and I wasn't gonna not film. Fuck that. So far all I've done is cut my boards to a rough length and rip the rough edge so I can get ready for my glue up. I don't have a joiner, so I have to rely on my table saw to get a nice tight glue up. This isn't always easy, but sometimes you can get lucky. These boards were pretty square, so I was able to move forward pretty fast. Anyway, before I did my glue up, I ran everything through this small little planer just to get all the rough edges off. I'm not trying to square anything up here, I'm just trying to make it easier to sand later on. After that, I just applied some glue using my finger. No, I didn't use a finger. After that, I just applied some glue using an old chip brush, and then I just clamped it all up. Now it was time to give the whole top a rough sanding. I brought everything outside, gave it a rough sanding, and then using my brand new track saw, I cut the sides off to square it up and get it to the right length. I never had a track saw before, but I used some Christmas money I got to buy one this year, and oh man, I love it. You could easily clamp a straight edge to your workpiece here and just use a circular saw, but I will say the track saw made for a much easier cut. Now it was time to move on to the base of the table. I'm going to be using rough sawn 4x4s for the base, and that'll make it very sturdy and solid. I cut all my 4x4s to a rough length, and then it was time to figure out what angle my legs would be sitting at. To figure out my angle, I used a scrap piece of plywood and just cut it to a 10-degree angle to see what I thought, and that was exactly what I wanted to use, so I went with it. By using a scrap piece of plywood to figure out what angle I wanted to use for the 4x4s, I was able to figure it out without wasting any of my 4x4s, which I only had a certain amount of. My miter saw wasn't able to cut all the way through these, so I had to use a hand saw to just trim off the little bit at the end. I set a positive stop on my miter saw stand and then cut all of my legs to their final length. I ran all my 4x4s through the planer just to get off the rough edges, just like I had for my top. Now, to make sure that my two sets of legs matched perfectly, I built a little jig that I could sit the legs into while I was screwing them together. That way I knew that the two sides would be a perfect match. I laid my 4x4s out on a piece of plywood and then traced around them. Then I used my nail gun to nail boards around each of the 4x4s. Now when I lay my 4x4s into the jig, I can be sure that both sides are set up the exact same as one another. To screw these two sets of legs together, I just use my Craig jig drill bit. To screw these two sets of legs together, I just use a 3/8 inch drill bit. Jesus Christ. Forget it, never mind. I pre-drilled all of the holes on my legs before screwing them together. I did not bother to use any glue with this because butt joints just don't seem to glue up that good, and I figured these 3-inch screws would be strong enough. Once I had these legs screwed together, it was time to figure out the stretcher. I could have just screwed a 4x4 between the two sets of legs, but I decided a half lap joint would really help to strengthen up the base. So I measured it out and made multiple passes on the table saw, using my sled to help hold it up and keep it square to the blade. A dado stack would really help speed up this process, but I don't have one, and really you can do it without one, so there's no need. After I got the majority of the wood removed with my table saw, I went back with a chisel, and I just used my belt sander. I know it sounds silly, but it got it nice and flat and even. After that, I had to remove the wood for the section of each set of legs. I basically did the same thing I had just done with the table saw, but with a circular saw. I made multiple passes, removing small amounts, and then went back with a chisel to flatten it all out. Once the cuts were made, I was able to slide the two pieces together, and they fit perfectly. A nice tight fit, and there were no gaps. To make the 45s that would be connecting the top to the stretcher, I just laid them out and drew the line right on the board from the actual table itself. I made my cuts and screwed it all together. After that, it was time to flatten out the top. I came out on an extremely cold morning into my workshop and just got to work. I used a combination of my belt sander, a hand plane, and a palm sander to get this tabletop nice and flat. When I'm sanding to flatten out a tabletop, I like to use the belt sander against the grain with the first few passes, and then afterwards go back with a lighter grit and go along with the grain until you get a smooth flat top. This might not be the best idea, but it works for me and it gets the job done, so it's the way I've always done it. After that, all that was left to do for the base was sand it and fill in all the dowel holes. I used 3/8 inch dowels and some glue to fill in all the holes, then went back and sanded it all up to 220. I wasn't sure how I wanted to go about attaching the top to the base, but I had some 1/8 inch steel laying around, so I cut it to the appropriate size, drilled some holes in it, and routed out a spot for it to sit on my base. This way I could screw it down into the base and then up into the tabletop, holding the top onto the base. Once I had everything attached, I just went back and sanded everything with the palm sander up to 220, and then it was time to stain it. The customer had told me what stain they were looking for, so I went out and I picked up some pre-stained wood conditioner, which with pine you want to use. Staining pine can come out very blotchy, but when you use this pre-stained wood conditioner, you get a much more even coat. I applied the pre-stained conditioner and then moved on to applying my stain. After that, it was just a matter of sealing everything up and doing some light sanding in between each coat. I used an oil-based polyurethane for this, but there's lots of other options and you could just pick whichever one works for you. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you learned something. And please like, subscribe, share, all that stuff. Really appreciate it. Thank you again and hope you have a great day. Later.
Bye, see you again, and have a good dream.